There are people who live extraordinary lives filled with decisions and deeds which seem destined to mold the fiber of history. To keep an accounting of such folk seems right, and would be an easily defensible task, I think. But my life? I am barely 27, a writer of children's stories, and the proprietor of a summer fishing lodge. True, I am the only woman proprietor in the area, but it was more of a matter of chance and fortune, my uncle's retirement and my mother's money, which brought me to settle on Chautauqua Lake than any conscious plan. There was no struggle, no great obstacle to be overcome in my life's course. Still, a life may be extraordinary simply in its circumstances. I can feel my beloved smile. Annabel has always reminded me how miraculous it is that our lives have ever even touched. It is because I know she is right, and because I want you, young Lucy, to have a truer accounting of your heritage than a forged birth certificate, that I am preparing to write this now. For you see, though Annabel and I are both 27, I was born in the summer of 1960. She in the spring of 1879. I don't know if you will believe our story, Lucy. You are only 5 now, and too young to be told yet. But perhaps when you come of age you will answer the questions of who your real papa was, and why your 2 aunts live as we do, and why your great-grandmamma will one day sit in the room and wish you well. It will be your own decision to believe or not. I confess I don't know what I would think if someone sat me down and spun this yarn for me. After all, we each only know the truth of our own reality. But I know the magic in mine. I know because my beloved Annabel shares it with me, and there is simply no greater truth for me than the warm clasp of her arms. So for you, Lucy, and for you, my beloved, here is my accounting of our beginnings. Jenny Wren, October 12th, 1987. Chapter 1. What I remember most about Uncle Jake is his gentleness. It was such an odd contrast to his huge, bulky strength. Even as I grew, his stature never seemed to lessen, although when a man weighs in at over 200 and easily clears 6 feet, he's apt to look a lot like a lumberjack to other adults too. But he wasn't. A lumberjack, I mean. He was a fishing guide and the owner of a summer fishing lodge on Chautauqua Lake. His hands were calloused from tying barbed hooks, sanding down wooden holes, and rejuvenating dilapidated generators. He put salt blocks out for the deer in winter, took in his half-orphan niece for the summers, and chopped wood when he got angry about things. In all the summers spent with him, I never once heard Jake raise his voice in irritation. That was the sole thing he had in common with his brother, my father. I never heard father rant or rave about anything either, but Uncle Jake kept his voice calm because he believed nothing was ever solved by shouting. Crying maybe, talking probably, but shouting never. Father, on the other hand, simply never noticed anything worthwhile enough to get angry about. His life revolved around the chemistry lab at the university. How or why he ever married has always been beyond my comprehension. That his marriage could be deemed successful would require a redefinition of the word, though if asked, I'm certain he'd maintain he found nothing to complain about. Unless he remembered me. Then he'd probably chew on the stem of his pipe and nod a bit, before recalling that everything in life has its drawbacks. Needless to say, I never really thought of his house in Chicago as home. Neither did Mother, I think. The summer I turned 3, we began going to Uncle Jake's. He was an old bachelor even then, and enjoyed having us around as a ready-made sort of family. His sweetie, Mrs. Stevens, was a dear, and welcomed me into her domain, the lodge and the kitchen, as if I was one of her own daughters. She taught me how to cook, how to laugh, how to like being a woman. It took me years before I understood her husband had run away with someone or other, and hence she was neither divorced nor widowed. However, Uncle Jake was a stolid admirer of hers, regardless of the disgrace of her status. Small towns are great for disgrace and gossip, though neither Uncle Jake nor Mrs. Stevens ever bothered to come right out and confirm or deny the rumors of their relationship. She ran the lodge proper, while he ran the fishing and boating end of the establishment. She lived downstairs in the back rooms during the summer and spent the winters up the road with her daughter's family. But she never dated another fellow after her man left. She just spent summer evenings on the porch with Jake, and Jake spent every Christmas down the road with her kin. They were my family. It was none of my business who my uncle slept with. It was a code that was subtly but distinctly drilled into me. Bedroom affairs were private. If you respected someone, you let them be. That was all there was to it. Sometimes I wonder if that's such a sophisticated attitude, or if it's just an excuse for hiding. Probably a bit of both, but I was raised in a small-town place despite my mother's intentions. Maybe if she'd lived, she would have succeeded in instilling me with a little more rebellion against the bourgeoisie. Unfortunately, all she actually succeeded in doing was stirring a desperate longing for home. Not for Chicago particularly, but for some place safe and secure. Some place consistent, that didn't change floor plans, languages, or people quite so much. Some place where I belonged, and where I had roots. A place like Uncle Jake's. It was sheerly convenience that we summered at Chautauqua every year. Uncle Jake's familial fascination with me, his only niece, was merely an added benefit for Mother. It meant she had a perpetual babysitter between him and Mrs. Stevens, and it was a thing she took perpetual advantage of. That's sounding wicked, and I don't actually mean it to be. Mother was an artist by trade and by soul, and the summer classes at the Chautauqua Institute were some of the best in the country, if not the world. Sometimes she taught, sometimes she studied, but all the time she left me to my own devices. Although that was only for the summers. The winters were something quite different. The year I was 5, she took me with her to London, where I was taught to read rather early by a very competent nanny. At 6, it was private tutoring in Rome, and I also learned that my mother was near famous for her paintings. At 7, it was Paris, and I discovered I had absolutely no sense of color, but I found refuge in Twain, Milne, and Kipling. At 8, it was Zurich and Lucerne, where I discarded sketching entirely to replace it with music lessons. I fell in love with the barbaric guitar. Patience had never been Mother's long suit, but to do her credit, she did provide a music instructor amidst the odd collections of tutors and sitters she supplied me with. Then in August of 1969, just before we left Chicago for Amsterdam, Mother's car disintegrated on the expressway. A semi with a flammable cargo jackknifed coming down an on-ramp. It was during rush hour. Mine was not the only family with tragedy that day. I was 9. Father, being his usual implacable self, sent me off to Amsterdam as scheduled. It was the first year I was to be officially enrolled in any school, and the place boarded most of its girls, so arrangements were not hard to modify. I think I was in the Netherlands by the end of the week, but I'm not sure. I don't have very clear memories of that time. I only remember pecan waffle cookies, a small church in an out-of-the-way back court, and Emily Dickinson. It was the year I discovered poetry and loss. I was growing up rather quickly. The next 18 months taught me much. I learned to share feelings with paper and pen or music when there was no one around left to share with. I learned my father was just as content to have me in Chicago, attending the Catholic Girls' Academy around the corner, as in Europe, so I spent only the 1 year in the Netherlands. And I learned that Uncle Jake would fight to have me in the summers. Father agreed once I simply voiced my preference for the lake and the country. Being a city man who could not visualize life without laboratories, academic libraries, and lawyers automatically attending to bills and patent rights, he could not imagine anyone actually preferring rural living. His younger brother was an anomaly Father rarely spared a thought for. His wife had been involved with Chautauqua, so that had not been undefinable. One occasionally made sacrifices for one's work. But his daughter? Well, country air was good for growing children. And so I was allowed to continue the tradition established by Mother. I never asked Father if he was glad to be rid of me for those 3 months each year. I only knew I was glad to be rid of him. As I said, those 18 months taught me much between boarding school, Uncle Jake's, and Chicago. I learned the differences between obligation and love, and Uncle Jake loved me. During the school years, first in Amsterdam and later in Chicago, he was always there. Never a letter writer, Uncle Jake faithfully sent me a postcard every week and phoned every month. Diligently, he kept track of every question I would write, whether it was about snowstorms, Mrs. Stevens, or missing my mother. Then every second Sunday in the month, when he phoned, he'd answer those questions. When I was older, Mrs. Stevens confided in me that he'd kept half the county supplied with firewood the winter I was in Amsterdam. He and my father had never been able to talk things out. Little wonder that the summers I had once longed for became the summers I literally lived for. Summers in Uncle Jake meant going home. More and more I felt as if Chicago was merely a boarding house from which I attended school, and breathlessly I'd await the summer holidays and home. Those feelings only grew as the years wore on, as I came to know myself and Annabel better. It was late August in the summer of '71. I had just turned 11. The sky was a very clear blue, with barely a cloud in sight. An unusual occurrence, to say the least, because Chautauqua County in New York usually got more rainfall than Portland, Oregon. But it was such a beautiful day that it will always stick in my memory. Hot but not blistering, as the breeze was cool enough, and around the lake the hills huddled, green with maples and pastures. It was the kind of day I loved, perhaps simply because they did come so seldom. Uncle Jake sat grinning and rubbing his reddish beard, shaking his head at the tiny crappie I'd just fished out of the lake. The boat swayed a bit as he chuckled and grabbed my line, gently taking the little acrobat in hand to unhook it. "Jenny Wren, I don't know how you do it." His dark eyes sparkled at our familiar jest. "You always find the smallest critter about." Brown eyes which matched his, a crinkled-up freckled nose, and ruddy red pigtails all stared back at him with my widest grin. "What are you planning, eh?" He tossed the silvery bit into the water. "I know. You're teaching 'em to bite and get let off, so you can catch 'em easier when they're proper big keepers." "Maybe so," I stated, sticking my straight little nose high in the air. But I couldn't hold the pose and dissolved into laughter with him. The breeze tugged on the fishing line, and I lowered my rod tip as he got a better hold of the swinging hook. He reached overboard, barely rocking the huge old rowboat, and hauled the minnow bucket up over the side. A squeal of protest and laughter rode out on the light wind then, and alerted to the sound of piers, I squinted toward the shoreline. "We're almost out of bait, Wren. What do you say we—" His voice trailed off as he followed my gaze. A figure in white pants and sweater sat laughing on a giant worn rock as a smaller companion, obviously a girl, stood calf-deep in the water holding her skirts high as she reached for a drifting sailboat. The model was caught in the stubborn breeze, and even the gentle lapping of the waves toward the shore couldn't quite reverse its direction. "I bet I could get it for her," I spoke, half requesting the opportunity. I felt Uncle Jake's grin more than saw it, because my eyes were glued to those little square white sails. "Haven't been so many girls about to play with this summer, have there?" At that I did look at him. Then with something of a blush I shrugged. "Hasn't been so bad." "Want to bet?" I shrugged again. Pre-adolescents are not always the most communicative, even with adults they love and trust. "So how far you think it is?" With a blink I turned back to gauge the distance. "Only a couple 100 yards or so." "Or so," he added meaningfully, but this time his grin was a reassurance. "Well, I guess you managed the Cross Lake swim easy enough last week. This ought to be a cinch." "Ought to." I agreed cheerfully and reeled up my line, quickly hooking the barb to the rod. "Leave your t-shirt on," he advised sternly as I slipped out of my canvas shoes and shorts. "Bathing suit's not enough in the sun. Your nose is already gonna be burnt to a crisp." "Is not. I put lotion on like you said." But I didn't take my top off. I really did have an awful lot of freckles already. "And mind your toes." At that one I stopped in mid-scramble and peered overboard questioningly. "Why?" "See there, Doc?" He pointed at the well-worn wooden length. "It's long because there's a shelf along the lake shore here." "Then why doesn't she just wade out and get her boat?" "She's right where she belongs if she doesn't swim." That was an astonishing thought to me. How could anyone be spending the summer at the lakeside if they didn't swim? What kind of girl was this, anyway? "We could just row over and get it," Uncle Jake suggested, noticing my stillness. "Not on your life," and then I hopped over the side as he started to chuckle. "I'll be watching," he called then. "No fancy stuff." Fancy I didn't need, but after years of globe-trotting, I knew the value of a good opening when I saw one. It had never been particularly hard for me to find playmates. Yet I knew how much easier it was to be included in a game if I was returning a stray ball or offering to add a doll to the tea party than if I was just a bystander trying to get in. It was something my nanny in London had taught me very early on. It wasn't a very long swim at all, and I paused a few yards from the small boat, pushing the wet bangs out of my eyes. Then, with my best overhand crawl, I came up to the thing. "Hey! Hey, you! That's not yours!" The white-clad jester on the rock resolved itself into an adolescent male. "Just what do you think you're doing?" I stood up. The boat hadn't even cleared the edge of the shelf yet. "I said, what are you doing?" He was an obnoxious-looking boy with dark hair falling into his eyes. He raked his fingers through it, only making it worse, and his scowl wasn't in the least way cordial. "Don't you want it back?" I shouted with my most practical grown-up manner. "It's not going to do you much good out in the middle of a lake, you know." "Why, you little—" "Yes, please, I would like it back." I grinned at her. She was my age, but not as stick-skinny as I. Standing there with her navy blue skirts clenched up about her knees, showing her white bloomers. Bloomers, geez! Was there a grandmother in charge of dressing her? But she was smiling and looked much friendlier than the older one. I barely resisted making a face at him. Politeness can be prudent, though, so I knelt back down in the water and cautiously swam their model in. I was proud of myself. I made shore without scraping a knee or waterlogging their toy, and as I stood up to gingerly walk in the last few stony feet, I must have been beaming. "Bother, it's another bratty girl." My chin jutted out and my eyes burned a hole through his measly, scrawny body. "Oh, don't mind Dickie. He's 15 and on his way off to England for school next month." "Yes, don't mind me at all," he reiterated distinctly, picking up a discarded book. "I've decidedly more important matters to attend than playing beach guard for a pair of silly—" "A lousy guard, too," I interjected rudely. "Can't even save a stupid boat." He turned kind of red and stomped off, which suited me just fine. I hate insufferable people. Male or female, they are the worst commodity civilized humanity has yet to create. A delighted giggle brought me back, and I grinned as she confided, "I've been wanting to do something like that for days." She turned and walked out of the water, still talking. "He's been with my great-aunt's people for most of the summer, and honestly, I wish he had stayed. I don't give a fig for any old school in England, and he parades about here as if he's some long-lost Duke of Windsor." "Is he your cousin?" "Regretfully, no." Her hair was tied in a blue ribbon matching her skirt and sailor-styled blouse, and as she turned, she pushed the ends of a ponytail over her shoulder. "He's my brother, 4 years older and 100 years ruder." Her hair wasn't really so light brown, I noticed. It was shining with all of the bronze and gold of autumn if you looked very closely. "I hope he didn't hurt your feelings." Startled, I realized I was staring and abruptly thrust the ship at her. "Here, it's all right, I think." Her eyes were the color of liquid cinnamon. They made me smile as we stood there toe-to-toe. "I'm Annabel," and impulsively she put out her hand. Jennifer Castle, from the lodge across, other side of the lake there." She had a great handshake, not at all flimsy, and I grinned even broader. "Standish's from Philadelphia," she supplied, both hands firmly about the model boat again. We're here with Grandmama for the summer." Curious, I eyed the sweeping green lawn behind her. Most of the property was hidden from the lake by the line of elms, willows, and maples. But beyond, a yellow Victorian house with white gingerbread trim sat cheerfully back on its small crest. "Nice," I admitted. "I'm just around for the summers, too. I come live with my Uncle Jake. He runs the fishing lodge over there. In the winter I go to the school in Chicago. Live with my father." Her eyes shadowed with sympathy. "Your mother is gone?" "Both of my parents are, too. They died when I was still young." "Well," I shrugged awkwardly, "Mother's been gone 2 summers now." Her hand touched my arm. She understood. It wasn't the grief so much as the awkwardness at being different. "Oh!" She glanced past me, startled. I turned, looking back over my shoulder towards the lake. "Is that your uncle?" "Yep." He was rowing in with his usual unhurried, powerful strokes. Behind Annabel, I noticed someone coming down the lawn. "Is that your grandmother?" Annabel spun about briefly. "Yes." Her grin was infectious as she faced me again. I suppose they're about to inquire of each other's business and decide if we're suitable acquaintances or not. Should we be friends anyway? She looked at me seriously for the longest moment, then with a decisive little nod, agreed. I think we shall. She offered her hand again to seal it. And who do we have here, my child? Grandmamma, this is Jennifer Castle. Annabel lifted the model for emphasis. She swam in and rescued my boat for me. The solemn countenance of the silver-haired matriarch disappeared with her smile, and the kindest gray eyes I'd ever seen turned to me. I'm delighted to meet you, Miss Jennifer Castle. I felt like I should curtsy or something, as I recognized the eloquent lilt of the Oxford-tinted English which was learned in European boarding schools as a second language. Impeccably learned, and from a very exclusive school, Mother would have interjected. I kind of nodded and stuttered. Ma'am. Please, Grandmamma Standish. All of Annabel's and Richard's young friends call me such. Thank you. And I actually felt like smiling again. No, it is we who should thank you. It seems you appeared exactly at the moment Annabel most needed you today. Oh, well, I didn't really do anything special, or... Nonsense, child. But the way Grandmamma's gentle voice enfolded me was warm like a hug. There was no rebuke in her words. Each of us can be special, or magical if we want to be, and you are no exception. Now, she nodded towards the dock as I heard Uncle Jake's familiar step clump down the planks. Who do we have here? It's her uncle, her father's brother. Annabel glanced at me tentatively. Yeah, my Uncle Jake. I mean, Joseph Castle. Good afternoon, ma'am. Jake pulled a floppy old fishing hat from his head. He wiped his lake-watered and fish-smelly hand down the side of his overalls before offering a handshake. I missed what they were saying as a small piece of me died in mortification. There Grandmamma Standish was, some grand descendant of nobility, clad in high-necked black lace from head to toe, talking to my seemingly hick-town uncle, who looked nothing like the prosperous, well-educated son of the deceased industrialist. But I did myself credit. I straightened my backbone, reminded myself of all those shallow people I'd met between Amsterdam and Chicago, and I stubbornly refused to be swallowed up by the earth. He was my uncle, and the best there was anywhere. The strain of pretending no disgrace, and the internal shame of needing to pretend at all had its price. I remember absolutely nothing about the rest of our visit. I know we stayed for lemonade, but it was Uncle Jake who determined that though the Standishes were returning to Philadelphia come end of the week, they would be spending the next summer here once more at their lake house. It was he and Grandmamma Standish who arranged for Annabel and I to see each other the weekend after 4th of July. To this day, I thank the stars that Uncle Jake was there after all. Left to my own devices, I would never have managed to see Annabel again.